Eduardo has to work unless it's raining, so he hasn't been here yet. And Zach had some other commitments. So I'm gonna present about the tides and life. Beep. So when we look at the way gravity works, gravity is gonna pull on objects, and so there's a gravitational attraction between the moon and the earth. There's a gravitational attraction between the earth and the sun. Even though the sun is much more massive than the moon is so much more close, that gravitational influence is, the battle goes to the moon. Since most of the surface of the earth is liquid, that liquid is going to be more sloshy. It's going to tend to slosh more than the land is. So it's going to respond to that gravitational pull from the moon. It very much depends on the orientation between the moon and the sun though. So the sun is able to pull somewhat on the water. And the alignment there leads us to having higher tides and lower tides. So the spring tides are the highest of the tides, and that's either when we have a full moon or when we have a new moon. The new moon would be the highest of the tides because now both of those big bodies are pulling the water that way. Where the full moon still has high tides, but it's not quite as dramatic. Beep. A neap tide is the smaller of the tides, and that's when we have the first and the last quarter of the moon. And so now you're not lined up with your gravity, and so the moon and the sun are kind of fighting for who's going to control that water. And so that's when you have your lower tides. Beep. The Bay of Fundy in eastern Canada has the highest tidal range of anywhere on the earth. It has a 45-foot tidal swing. I don't see a map of it. I wish I saw a map of it so I could describe more.
Is that on a daily basis?
When it's the highest of tides. So the Bay of Fundy is right there. I believe that's just close to Maine. I believe that's the Bay of Fundy. It has a 45-foot tidal swing when it's the highest of tides, and so that means the water level changes by 45 feet. So that's insane. And this is another thing, this is just a weird coincidence, that the Bay of Fundy is the perfect length that when the high tide gets up to the northeast edge of that bay, it's low tide out here. And when the water, by the time the water flows all the way back out of the bay, it's back to high tide. And so that cycle goes on back and forth. I've always been curious how they do that with the fishing boats, because your boat is either dry or it's wet, and you only have a couple of hours to go out and go fishing before the tide goes back out. Have you ever lived coastal where you've had something like this?
Yeah.
Yeah? I can't imagine that, so what's that like?
Never really thought a whole lot about it.
Okay. I mean, but you gotta plan your fishing trip.
Well, not that, to that extreme, no.
Okay, yeah, so that's what, yeah, you have to plan your fishing trip, because if you don't get back, you know, I suppose they have buoys out there where you just would anchor your boat. I don't really know how that works.
In Monterey Bay, they just have markers for the shoals.
Sure, yeah. Very cool. There's also, can you click on that video? The Inuits, this is really cool.
Underneath the sea ice, the tide is going out. And out. The floating ice drops a staggering 12 meters, nearly 40 feet, exposing the seabed and hopefully the bounty thereafter. Lukasi and his friends try to get under the ice as quickly as possible. They They have just half an hour before the tide comes back in. The world beneath their feet is unstable. The giant blocks of ice are no longer supported by water and could collapse at any moment.
No way.
You have a half hour.
This is the only place on Earth where the tides are extreme enough to allow people to dare venture under the sea ice.
Wonder who
And
discovered it.
in a chamber that moments ago was underwater, they find what they're looking for. Mussels. All they could hope for. Now they have just minutes to gather all they can carry. The returning tide is an unstoppable force.
Lukalok kami niya nga. Then sumaler. Andi ko na simito ako ta. Tukulo ka. Sene ka naman.
As the sea steadily flows back, it lifts the huge blocks of ice over their heads. Even as they escape, the ice shifts around them. The ocean reclaims its secret garden.
Remember, I just
How to
remembered.
build an igloo.
So that's the only place on Earth where the tide is extreme enough and the ice is thick enough that when the water goes out, they build up those little tunnels and they can chop their way through the ice and go down there and collect the mussels. Absolutely insane. I always wonder, who was the first one to do that? To think, hey, you can go under here and go run around. But just really, really quite remarkable. So the tides are pretty cool, and I'll talk more about tides in my speech. When I go to the coast, I try to do this kind of undercover. I like to go out there when the tide is like as high up as it gets, and put a mark or a stick or something in the sand, just something, subtle. And then go out there again when the tide is out, just to kind of see, because it really is, like when we're in Alabama, it's hard to tell, because the beach is just so vast there. When we were out in Oregon, that was fun. We would go down to the shore and look at the little tide pools, the critters that were left behind when the tide goes out and then the tide comes back in. So that's always been fun. And I'm gonna talk about this in my speech, so we can skip that for now. So that's how the tides work. We don't really see a whole lot of that action here, but if you ever go coastal, there's a calendar, and the calendar says when the high tide is and when the low tide is. So, is that everybody now?
I think so.
Okay, now it's mine. Actually, you're gonna stay here, 'cause I need someone to,
Yay!
I need someone to beep at. Let me find my.
You know, we could find a more subtle way to do that, so we don't have to yell, beep, across the.
Oh, did you pause that, Storm?
No, I didn't.